is not just about, getting, a VO2 number or something like that. It's really about, understanding what systems are strong, what systems are weak, and having a clear vision on how your next training session can be maximized.
Taking the data that we've collected in the test and then managing it in a way to help give advice to the athlete in real time so that they can adjust their performance to meet the demands that's been identified in the test.
Instead of using a run pace or using a heart rate output to establish, how you're going to run your next marathon, it's like, well, no, let's start your marathon breathing a 4 and 4 pace, taking 4 steps to breathe in, 4 steps to breathe out.
It had to be different for every individual, so it couldn't be a standardized test because it responded differently depending on the athlete, and it's really difficult to study the validity of a test when every test you do is different.
Okay, we are now on the podcast. Luke, Andrew, how are you guys doing?
Oh, awesome.
Fantastic.
Okay, it's good to have you guys on. It was a bit of a challenge with the scheduling the last few weeks to find us all. We're in 3 different parts of the world. I guess, Luke, you're not too far from me right now, but still always a challenge to coordinate those things. But nonetheless, it's really great to have you both on. I've been looking forward to that episode for quite some time. So yeah, let's get it done. Maybe to get started with, Andrew, give us a quick intro. Who are you and what you do? And then Luke, you can do the same.
I'm Andrew Sellars. I'm co-founder and science advisor to Isocapnic Incorporated, which produces Breathe Way Better. My day job is working as a GP anesthetist in a small town in Western Canada called Salmon Arm. And I am also co-founder of VO2 Master, which you and I have talked about before, which it's a great pleasure to be back with a different hat on this time. But I am a big fan of everything physiology and training, mostly in endurance sports, and a huge passion for seeing people improve their performance.
Fantastic. And for those who want to learn a bit more about you, Andrew, we've had multiple occasions to exchange, to chat before, so you guys can go check out the previous episodes. Luke, first time we're having you on. It's been a long time coming, my friend, so I'll let you go for it.
Hey, thanks, man. I'm Luke Way. I'm a coach by day and CEO of Isocapnic by night. I'm currently, in the middle of camp season here. So we've gone from altitude national team camps in Flagstaff, Arizona, to volume camps in Mallorca, Spain, to preparation for World Cup camps in Sardinia, which was amazing. And now we're just in transit to actually one of my athletes' races in the Finale Ligure, Italy, where he's going to be competing for his 5th world title as 24-hour world champ.
Okay, well, fantastic. Quick intro here. So I want to dive right into things so we can have some time to discuss. We're going to talk quite a bit about, I hope at least, about respiratory training and everything that goes around it. But first of all, Luke, I want to ask you about your testing process. You do quite a bit of testing with your athletes to establish some guidelines on what to do, how to do it. So maybe talk about your testing process and how it evolved through the years to where it is now today. Yeah.
So I came into testing honestly as an athlete. Years ago, I would have testing done at universities and get a whole bunch of raw data and maybe some useful information, but nothing really explained very well. Then the day came where I started chatting more with Andrew, and it became more of this like assessment process of like, hey, let's like, play with this little idea over here. Let's try to like, figure out like, prove some things wrong that might otherwise be unexplained. And so that became like really appealing to me. It's like, oh wow, this is really, really neat. And so through Jurg's association with Andrew, Jurg Feldman, they came up with the Herblin-Chlebcheck test, the FACT test, where you find the lactate balance point. And so when I shifted over to start coaching with balance point racing, which was Andrew's squad, really became more my job to sort of execute those assessments, and become the communicator. Jurg and Andrew are both very physiology based, very, very, very smart people. Sometimes not the easiest to communicate with because their brains are so large. And so with me having a slightly smaller brain, I get to dumb it down a little bit and make it very relatable and communicate the ideas a little bit more succinctly, so people are able to really take that critical information and execute it, in their daily training. And so, we took those protocols and have been building it over the years, finding new technology like Moxie, helping develop technologies like VO2 Master, and then always trying new things, always trying to keep the ball rolling on how we can objectively test and direct athletes with real objective data.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've built the balance point assessment on top of that, where we're collecting as much objective data as possible, so we can give the best possible advice with how training changes in your next session. It's not just about getting a VO2 number or something like that. It's really about understanding what systems are strong, what systems are weak, and having a clear vision on how your next training session can be maximized, because that your system is built in this way.
Mm-hmm. So if we talk about balance point for a second, and maybe Andrew, you can take a piece of that one, for folks that are not familiar with the term, if you had to equate it or vaguely equate it, because we know that none of the metrics that we want to compare are actually directly comparable. But what is balance point in reference to what maybe people that are versed in the exercise physiology realm, what's the equivalent there we're talking about when we talk about balance point?
So balance point was Jurg Feldman's idea to explain the challenge of the perception that people get to a point where they can, above the intensity which they could not sustain performance, and below that intensity they could sustain it fairly well. And so a lot of people call that thresholds, and there were as we've talked about before, lots of different ways that people tried to determine what that threshold was. And he didn't like the idea of a threshold, and when he developed his a unique way of looking at lactate, he called it a lactate balance point. And what he showed over and over again, and through thousands of tests that we did, is that everybody has a point at which they shift from being able to clear lactate to a level at which they began to increase their lactate. And that changes over time. It changes within a single session. It changes with breathing patterns. There's lots of things that we can do to manipulate that balance point, but the idea of a balance point came originally from Jurg Feldman's understanding and interpretation of a special test that we did called the lactate balance point test. That became the fundamental basis for how we began training people going on 20 years ago now. And we started a team based on the fundamental theories of coaching that Jurg had taught us. And we called it the Balance Point Racing Team. Luke joined us a few years after we were showing some success with a number of age group triathletes, mostly triathletes, some mountain bikers. And Luke was a very good Xterra athlete out of Alberta originally, and had great success with a coach in Alberta. One of my nemesis, who used to race against me all the time and beat me regularly. And Luke came over and picked up the mantle of balance point as we were starting to add all these other new devices that were making assessments much more detailed than just a lactate balance point test. So the original test was lactate, heart rate, and wattage. Luke and the group that we were working with, we began adding oxygen consumption. We had a tabletop VO2 analyzer that we started to use, an old FitMate. Soon after Luke came on board, we were introduced to Moxie and started using Moxie. then there were other things. There's now we have access to things like core body temperature. Luke uses a little thing called EMA capnometer to do CO2 exhalation, to give real-time exhaled end tidal CO2s. And so the data that he's collecting now is still based on the same theories of balance point, but now we recognize that there's a number of balance points. And what we originally saw was a metabolic balance point. And now with the extra equipment we have lots of ways of looking at respiratory balance points, neurologic balance points, cardiac balance points, and all the different systems have different break points, thresholds, balance points. So that's what Luke's assessment is unique in the fact that he looks at all of those systems differently and separately to help identify which ones need the most work.
Yeah, that makes sense. What comes to mind is a recent paper that talked about that gray zone around that second threshold. And if we talk about MLSS and critical power and, break points on Moxie, all those things fall in the same kind of ballpark area, but there are some differences. Some are systemic, some are local. And so we can't necessarily expect the same response there. Now, if we were to compare that balance point on a technical level to an MLSS, so we know that currently, at least as it is defined, MLSS is usually on a 30-minute test, a rise in lactate above 1 millimole between minute 10 and 30. I know Andy Jones has proposed to shorten that window and make it, I think it was 20 to 30 minutes, so that there was a better agreement between MLSS and critical power. Now, how, if we had to put that balance point on that spectrum, where would it fall?
Yeah, so MLSS is a version of a test that was trying to recreate the test that Jörg created and make it publishable in the science, because the challenge with balance point testing was that it had to be different for every individual. So it couldn't be a standardized test because it responded differently depending on the athlete. And it's really difficult to study the validity of a test when every test you do is different. Mm-hmm. So to say, it's really difficult to say how a balance point would be assessed by an MLSS test, but in general, it's slightly lower because, again, when you go above and below balance point, you will see a trend. Below balance point, you'll see a lactate that trends down. At balance point, you'll have no change in lactate, no change in heart rate, no change in oxygen consumption. Everything is stable. Above balance point, you'll have a slow, steady rise in lactate. It might only go up in a very well-trained athlete. It'll only go up 0.1 every 10 or 15 minutes. If you're just over their balance point, it's going to hardly change at all. Mm-hmm. The further above you go, if you go 10 watts over it or 20 watts over it, it's going to climb faster. And we know that historically. The harder you go above threshold, the faster the lactate's going to climb. If you go right on balance point, nothing's going to change. And that was what we showed with every single athlete, that you could find a point or a narrow range at which nothing would change. Lactate would stay same, respiratory rate and volumes would stay the same, heart rate would stay the same, you were stable. So typically that balance point was lower than what most people would determine a threshold, because we were saying that everything would be stable. You can go above that and sustain it for quite a while, but you are compensating either with a rising heart rate or by changing your breathing patterns to adjust to the higher levels of acidity and the higher CO2 that's being created. Mm-hmm. And at some point, that ability to compensate breaks down and you fall apart. Below balance point, you didn't have to compensate anything. All the systems were in balance and you could sustain it for much longer. Mm-hmm. So the balance point was typically a lower intensity than what most people thought of as a functional threshold or a lactate threshold or anything else. And this is exactly the challenge, is that most thresholds are too high, and anybody who trains close to that falls apart very quickly. So the intervals are shorter. At balance point, you can sustain it, and you can see that in the performances that people do at their balance point.
Which kind of makes sense from an internal metabolic stability standpoint, right? We want to have a balance, hence the term on the inside, so that we know that we're in a true steady state. So it's interesting that, but it's good now that mentally I can place that point on the spectrum between all those different ways to calculate thresholds. So I want to talk now about respiratory data. So we have Andrew here from VO2 Master, but not only. Luke, when you do a test and if you have respiratory data for an athlete, what do you look at? What do you look at when it comes to frequency? What do you look at when it comes to volume, and how those relate to intensity?
When using the when we're looking at the respiratory data, it all starts with the spirometry. Knowing the context before we even test is important. So looking at your forced exhalation volume over 1 second, forced exhalation volume over 6 seconds, and the ratio between the two is very important. Knowing if somebody's going to be going into the test with a functional ability of only breathing 2.5 liters is really important. Regardless of how big and tall they are. If that's only what they can muster in their best possible breath, then we could never expect them to breathe 5 liters, while riding a bike or running or whatever. So it starts with the spirometry, and then from there we look to see, what their steady state looks like. Whether we see the same sort of trends that we might see with like heart rate as intensity goes up. Do we see volumes increase? Do we see their respiratory frequency react in sort of a linear way, and looking to see when we find any breaking points or any balance points or thresholds, which where we can say, okay, at this point we actually lost a whole bunch of tidal volume, or at this point we saw no change or even a degradation of the respiratory frequency. And so the whole idea is less about finding these maximal numbers and more about trying to understand whether or not the athlete is using their lungs well. If we can make an argument that they are completely undertrained or underdeveloped with their respiratory system, which is very common, and then build them a training program around that.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do when you talked about spirometry, so we have our FEV1 and FVC6. How do you interpret the volumes that you might see during a dynamic effort relative to those numbers? Personally, and I got that from Daniel Crumbach, I take 85% of FEV1 as being kind of the high number that I would like to see somebody be able to breathe during a dynamic effort. Do you use something similar or a little bit different?
Yeah, so FEV1 is a very important one for us. I mean, it's the functional end of things. How much power the athlete has sort of at disposal in their respiratory system. We like to see an average of 70% throughout the test. We want to see, being able to hold that 70% at very low levels, and at it or exceeding that 70% at the upper levels. And so the average being about that 70% marker. Of course, at the at more maximal type efforts or even sub-maximal efforts, we'll see them breathing much more than that 70%. But average, I like the 70% rule because it shows pretty clearly whether or not an athlete has a respiratory system that's been reasonably well trained. For example, I test athletes frequently that don't have a lot of respiratory training in their past, and it's commonly they average around 40 or maybe 50% throughout the test, and routinely our athletes that do lots of respiratory training, obviously it's much easier for them to hold like 75 or even high 70% as an average throughout a long hour-long assessment.
Luke, can you just clarify when you're talking about 70%? Are you talking about 70% of FEV1 or 70% of FEV? Okay.
Yeah.
Andrew, maybe you can chime in on this. When you look at someone's respiratory data, what does somebody with respiratory training's breathing look like versus somebody who's untrained? Andrew, if you were to kind of explain two different profiles that you might see in maybe a cyclist.
Yeah, so That's good. That's a great question. So the two big things that we see is one is a symmetrical breathing pattern, so a sinusoidal wave of pattern of breathing. So consistent tidal volumes and respiratory frequencies across a wide range of intensities. So so not only a repetitive pattern, but also slower respiratory frequencies. So large tidal volumes, slow respiratory frequencies, much more efficient, and good, well-trained respiratory athletes will be able to handle large variations in power outputs or speed outputs with slow respiratory frequencies and large tidal volumes. In comparison to an untrained athlete, who tend to have much more erratic breathing patterns. So they'll take a few deep breaths and then they will breathe very shallow and fast for a few breaths, and then they'll sigh, or they'll try and take another deep breath, and they won't be able to maintain any rhythmic pattern. So that's the first thing we see as an alarm phase of an athlete who's struggling to maintain the respiratory. And the other one is typically faster respiratory patterns because they don't have the ability to maintain good diaphragmatic movement. So they tend to have smaller tidal volumes and much higher respiratory frequencies.
Mm-hmm. What are the advantages of using larger tidal volumes and lower respiratory frequencies during a given effort?
So the big thing is the less times you breathe, the less muscular contractions you're doing, the less energy it takes. So slower breathing requires less energy. More energy can go into the process of moving you forward, whether you're on a bike or running or doing any CrossFit exercise. So slower respiratory patterns, better energy consumption. The other thing, when you get to very fast, high rates, there is a tremendous amount of dead space that's moving. So that's air that's moving in and out of the mouth and the upper airways that's not involved with the exchanging of gases, CO2 and oxygen. So if you breathe 60 breaths a minute, your dead space is doubled compared to breathing 30 breaths a minute. So 30 breaths a minute times 3 liters per breath of 90 liters a minute is a much better pattern than 60 breaths a minute times 1.5. With an increase you're doubling your dead space. You'll actually remove about 10 liters of that 90 liters is actually just dead space moving back and forth. So even though on the equipment, it'll read that you're moving the same amount of air, you're actually not exchanging the same amount of air in the lungs.
Luke, maybe can you talk to us about the main differences that you might see in breathing patterns on, let's say, a triathlete between running and cycling?
I mean, it's cycling, depending on the position, from a regular upright hooded position, we typically have a little bit more range of motion on the diaphragm. Then you would, in maybe like aero position, for example, we get quite closed off, especially when the body comes down a little bit. So I actually see probably more variability in bike positions than I do from a hooded position on the bike to standing up on the run. Mm-hmm. I actually do see quite a bit of difference in people's ability to breathe from treadmill to running on a track.
How do you explain
the coordination of running? Yeah, it's difficult to explain, quite honestly. But I explain it away by the lack of coordination that a lot of people have running on the treadmill compared to running in the real world. They're a little bit more relaxed. They're not so worried about their foot placement when they're running in the real world. When they're on a treadmill, depending on the treadmill, it's certainly a little bit more high stakes in terms of foot placement, and I find that they get a little bit more choppy in that scenario. So I try to keep it real world as much as possible, but obviously, when you're trying to replicate perfect lab settings for outputs, it's difficult. So we use the treadmill quite a bit.
When I was younger, I don't know where it came from or where I heard it, but I would always run and have it was probably like 2 on the inhale and 1 on the exhale, or 3 on the inhale, 2 on the exhale, and never have those 2 match. What do you usually recommend people do with their breathing in terms of entrainment with their stride? Should they entrain their breath? Should they not? And if so, how?
I mean, I love training the breath on the run, especially in breath patterns. In fact, that's one of the first things that I teach athletes that are new to our program, is different breathing patterns and using breathing patterns as a way of pacing. Instead of using a run pace or using a heart rate output to establish, how you're going to run your next marathon. It's like, well, no, let's start your marathon breathing a 4-4 pace, taking 4 steps to breathe in, 4 steps to breathe out. And then at the halfway mark, if that feels really good and you feel like you're on fire, then maybe let's shift to a 3-3 pattern and see if you can go a little bit faster. And so what this does is govern their system by their ability to exhale CO2. Once their CO2 gets up to a certain level, they need to breathe more, right? And when they push hard enough, their body produces that CO2 and they have to exhaust it out of their respiratory system. And so we use the 4 and 4s to help just like govern the system. And it gives them something very like simple to think about. They're not having to worry about the lag in heart rate, or how pace might change on a hill versus on a downhill or headwind or whatever. It's completely intrinsic metabolic data that is just simple. 4 steps in, 4 steps out, and away they go. And then, the nice thing about that is that as they get better and better at controlling their CO2 levels, their breathing becomes deeper and slower, right? They become better at using their respiratory system to manage what it is that their body is doing. And so they end up breathing larger ventilation numbers at that same, 4 and 4 breathing pattern, for example. So we use that a lot.
That's super interesting. And Andrew, I'd like you to comment on that. But essentially what we're talking about here is using all the tech that we can to assess someone, but then, going back to perception. And, it is the center of everything that we do, despite all the data that we might be able to gather with different devices. So talk about this, Andrew, for a minute, because you work with VO2 Master, you work with Isocapnic. So those companies or at least VO2 Master is very data driven, obviously, because you were collecting respiratory data from athletes and oxygen consumption data in real time. But then we go out and we coach them just by counting their breaths, which I love. I think it's fascinating, but it might seem like a bit of a contradiction for some. So how do you wrestle with that?
And it's not a contradiction, because what it's doing is taking the data that we've collected in the test and then managing it in a way to help give advice to the athlete in real time so that they can adjust their performance to meet the demands that's been identified in the test. So if you actually think about what Luke's doing is by breathing a 4 and 4 breathing pattern, if an athlete is running 90 RPM, then a 4 and 4 breathing pattern comes out to 22.5 breaths a minute. So during a step test or during any kind of graded interval test, you can actually see at what speed they hit that point where they're magically hitting 22.5 breaths a minute. Now we're assuming that the patients, that the clients' cadence is sitting at 90 and doesn't change depending on the speed. So, but that's another piece of data that you can collect, right? It's super easy with modern watches to pick up cadence scores. The interesting thing is, as Luke mentioned, that 4 and 4 is actually a perfect pacing suggestion for most athletes for a sustained running pace. It's not so fast that they're going to burn themselves out, and it's not so slow that they're just jogging below an intensity that actually is getting them somewhere fairly quickly. Because you can switch. Luke can do the same thing. He can push athletes to breathe 6 and 6, or 6 in and 8 out, or 6 and 10. And guess what? They have to run really slowly, short stride lengths, fast feet, but slow breathing. And that becomes a new training idea. And that pattern, so if you go to 6 and 6, you're actually going to slow your breathing down to 15 breaths a minute. And for a lot of people, they actually can't run with that slower breathing pace because they will be forced into a faster breathing pace. So they can't sustain it for very long. But with training, you can tolerate higher CO2 levels, and you can actually train yourself to be able to breathe 6 and 6 or 6 and 10. And those now training advice is based on observed respiratory frequencies that you can see with VO2 Master with the testing device to see how people breathe during a graded step test. So you can see the athletes that can maintain the slower running paces at 14, 15 breaths per minute. You can see when they switch over to 20 to 25 breaths a minute, and there's a definite pattern at which they can handle a couple different steps at that breathing pattern. Then they'll switch to 3 and 3, which at 90 RPM is 30 breaths a minute. Mm-hmm. Then you can see the moment that they switch to a 2 and 2 pattern, that's 45 breaths a minute. And so you'll quite often see on a graded step test, they'll go from low 20s to a couple steps, or maybe just one step, or even maybe just a partial step where they switch to 30, and then they quickly rise up to 45 when they start pushing harder. And those now become graded zones that you can show them on a test using a VO2 Master. And then they correlate it to step rates like Luke uses when he's coaching the athletes. And so the combination of testing and showing them what actually happens at different speeds to their breathing patterns, and then associating with those breathing patterns with different paces on a track or when they're running in a race is absolutely connected to their ability to be able to see it in test results.
Yeah, I think
so. Yeah, I don't see it just. I see it as being you can't actually. It empowers the athlete to have seen it during testing.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I've been using it more and more like this. And in full transparency, I'm affiliated with both VO2 Master and IsoCapnic, just so everything is clear. I love the devices and I use them, and I have no problem, promoting and talking about them. But I've been using the VO2 Master more recently in that feedback kind of dynamic. I worked with a horse rider recently, and she had a hard time breathing on her horse. And so we worked with the VO2 Master on a bike, and she was able to see how she breathes. And the feedback that I got from her is that, wow, I have a different animal underneath me now, just because the horse can obviously sense how the rider is feeling and what the rider is doing. And if the rider is not breathing or shallow breathing, then that's going to have an impact on the horse. And she said that if she just focuses on relaxing and breathing deep breaths and being steady with her breathing, and it has a tremendous impact on her ride, which I thought was fantastic.
I would love to see VO2 Master used when she's actually riding her horse, right? Because you could sit in the inside of a ring if she's running in a relatively small circle. Mm-hmm. You could actually see how she changes her breathing patterns with the different motions of the horse. So if she goes from a walk to a canter to a gallop, and see how the different challenges to that core positioning changes her need to breathe differently, whether she's having to take shallower breaths because she's engaging more core and not allowing her diaphragm to move. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. That's a really fun part of having VO2 Master out in the public, is that people start using it in ways that we never dreamed of it being used. But what a great potential for educating athletes and helping develop them to be better, stronger athletes on horseback. That's brilliant.
Okay, so we talked about the testing. We talked about looking at respiratory data. Now I want to talk about training. So respiratory training. Maybe to get started, Luke, can you give us a respiratory training 101? What is it? And why should athletes get a bit more interested in that idea?
Oh gosh. All right. So, knowing what you know about how we look at athletes' physiology and how we guide athletes through their careers as athletes, we have become very passionate about the respiratory system as a major limiter in athletes' performance, and this has come through reams of objective data that we were always on the lookout for the next best thing to help train our athletes, and we've used many tools over the years to help kind of fulfill this goal of training athletes' respiratory systems, so they're not limiters anymore. And we ended up developing our own because we needed something that was incredibly versatile and easy to use, and able to access ranges of motion at high frequencies or low frequencies, depending on what the training would deliver. So So we came up with the Breatheway device, which is an isocapnic or a CO2 capturing respiratory trainer, and it allows athletes to breathe as hard and as fast as they could ever want or need or more, while keeping their systems safe, right? Like keeps their oxygen levels perfectly normal, and more importantly, keeping their CO2 levels in the acceptable range, so you don't feel faint and dizzy and that sort of thing. And so respiratory training 101, it really, like, number one comes down to how you would just access your diaphragm, right? A lot of people breathe backwards. They breathe through their chest. They don't breathe through their belly at all. And so we first would help athletes just use that range of motion. I mean, one of the things I love talking about is how, if you're going to go to a personal trainer at your local gym and you want to become, you have stronger biceps, they're probably not going to make you do squats. They're probably going to make you do bicep curls. And you're not going to just work through a range of motion like this, which is kind of like what your respiratory system wants to do, is use a small little choppy range of motion. Any good personal trainer is going to be like, well, no, you want to use a full range of motion. And so that's, what we try to teach athletes how to do. The problem is if
do you have some, sorry to cut you off, like, do you have a couple maybe tips for people that would like to, before we even get to, devices that we can use to train, from a mechanical standpoint, from a control standpoint, do you have a couple tips for people to better access their diaphragm and use that full range of motion during breathing?
100%. Yeah. All right, cool. So, I get to see my VO2 master shirt. Okay, so one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, right? Maybe reframe that a little bit. There we go.
For those who are listening to the audio, go to my YouTube channel, Upside Strength on YouTube, and watch the video so you can see what Luke is showing.
Okay, and I'll try to describe it so you hopefully don't have to even look at it. So if you have one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly button or your diaphragm, right? I want you to take a deep breath in, and I want you to feel your bottom hand, the hand that's on your belly, push out. So breathe in, the hand comes out. And then as you breathe out, you're going to squeeze your diaphragm like you're squeezing the bottom of toothpaste. You're trying to squeeze from the bottom, pushing the air out. Pooch your belly out, suck your belly in, right? And so that the range of motion comes from the softer part of your lower body, not through the ribs, right? This is going to, it actually takes a little bit of practice of learning how to do this to both like feel natural at doing it while running or biking or rowing or riding a horse, for example. But you actually become, you get access to greater ranges of motion the more you use this sort of diaphragmatic breathing. Now you can buy one of 100 breathing training books like Wim Hof or a plethora of others to learn about all the health benefits of good belly breathing. I won't have to go into that today, but it is much more effective to breathe through the belly that way. So that's probably one of the first things that I'll look at is helping athletes learn to breathe from the belly, and then from there we might look, mechanically speaking, towards like breathing out more like the back of your diaphragm, and using more of your torso that way to try to access more range of motion. But yeah, that's where devices start to become a little bit more handy, because as we access more intensity and more volume, then it's nice to not feel faint after taking 5 or 6 breaths.
Yeah, but I guess you need that foundation. It's a bit like you need the range of motion to do a deep squat before you put 100 pounds on your back and do a heavy squat. So before you load the system with any device that you might want to use, you want to make sure that mechanically you're breathing in a sound way. One I guess a word that I find helpful is thinking about a horizontal breath versus a vertical breath. So if somebody's breathing up through their shoulders, there's a lot of trap and a lot of chest versus trying to expand more through the back and to the sides, and that usually helps force you kind of to pull in the right direction. And I always find that the image is helpful, and usually you can, like you said, if you just look yourself in the mirror, and when you take a deep breath in, if your shoulders get closer to your ears, then you could probably improve those mechanics a little bit. So we have this, and now let's talk about how we can apply some resistance to the respiratory system in order to train it. There's a lot of different devices. And there's more and more devices that are coming out, it seems, by the day. Maybe, Andrew, can you kind of explain the distinction between devices that are aimed at applying a resistance to breathing? So we have, there's quite a few resistance kind of focused devices on the market. There's a lot less tools that are focused on volume. So maybe can you distinguish between those two and explain what each one is aimed at?
Yeah, sure. So there's a great deal of literature that shows the benefit of respiratory muscle training. There's very little evidence to improve performance with improving the strength of the muscles. The original studies were done, they date back to 1986. The first published study was actually 1991. There was some preliminary work done in Switzerland before that. Authors Fitting, Mador, Dempsey all looked at respiratory muscle training, but they used a device that allowed for endurance training of those muscles. And that meant being able to do repetitive muscular contractions without, as Luke mentioned earlier, without getting dizzy or without getting headaches. And that dizziness or headaches came from disruptions to CO2 levels. Yeah, so if you take it,
talk about this in detail, because it might not be clear for people why you start feeling dizzy if you essentially hyperventilate, even if you're taking a good breath and a deep breath, but if you essentially breathe more than what your body needs and you're at rest, then this is going to happen. So maybe why does that happen?
Exactly.
And then you can keep going after that.
Okay. So if you take 2 or 3 very deep filling breaths and blow them all the way out, you're blowing off CO2, you're hyperventilating, you're breathing more than you need to at rest. That hyperventilation causes a drop in your CO2. The CO2 levels in the body are very tightly regulated to balance your acidity, your pH of your body, because your body works in a very tight range of enzymatic processes that are dictated by pH values. And the normal physiologic pH is 7.35 to 7.45, very, very tightly regulated and closely associated with CO2 levels. When you blow off too much CO2, it triggers a number of cascades, but one of the things that happens is it vasoconstricts the blood vessels inside the brain to the point that you actually reduce oxygen tension in the cerebral spinal fluid and in the brain shuts down, and you begin to feel dizzy because your body, the next step is you're going to pass out, and that is the body's protective mechanism to have you lie down and to stop breathing so much, so that it'll allow the CO2 levels to start climbing again. So this is universal. Anybody who breathes more than 3 or 4 deep cleansing breaths in a row will push their CO2 levels to a level that makes them feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So a device was developed to help with the studies to allow athletes and patients to breathe quickly and deeply without blowing off their CO2, and allow them to actually do prolonged muscular endurance training for the respiratory system without having to ride a bike or go for a run. That was a Swiss company called Idiag that came out with SpiroTiger. This is now going on 25 years ago. And they were the first and only company to ever do that before Breatheway. The resistance devices were a pickup off of a simple idea of, if you increase the muscular strength of inspiratory or expiratory muscles or the diaphragm, you would improve performance. The challenge with those devices is that you can't use them at rest for more than 3 or 4 breaths. So it's like being limited to doing bicep curls where you can only do 3 bicep curls. And if you're trying to develop endurance, it's not a great way to develop muscular endurance by doing only 3 reps. You can use those devices under stressful situations, at low levels of exercise, even high intensity exercise, and you can add resistance to it. There has been shown in the literature to be some potential dangers to that with changing intracranial pressures. And it's mostly because people haven't developed good techniques for breathing, and all they're doing is what Luke mentioned earlier, which is strengthening muscles in a limited range of motion. So if you're using resistance devices but not doing full range of motion, then you're actually potentially causing a further problem by improving strength for limited range of motion, right? So this is what leads to injuries in athletes with hamstring pulls and Achilles tendonitis, and that is strong muscles under limited range of motion, and then you try to drive them over a wider range that they're not used to, and that's when problems occur.
It's like going back to the squat analogy. We talked about this before: technique first, movement first, range of motion first, then we apply the resistance. But if you don't have the range of motion, and then somebody trains doing, 8 quarter squats or even shorter than that, and then all of a sudden they have to go all the way down at the bottom of a squat with a heavy load, then we probably have a problem there.
And those resistance devices never allow appropriate range of motion. By definition, you will lose the end range of motion because you don't have strength in that range. So when you pile resistance onto a respiratory system that doesn't have full range of motion, you're going to make the problem worse.
Yes.
So it's the big problem with respiratory training that includes resistance.
Yeah, that's something that you mentioned to me when I was talking about those devices. I mean, in my mind, and that my strength and conditioning kind of general brain goes to, well, it's not one or the other. We need strength, we need endurance. Both they're probably complementary if they're used properly. But like you were telling me, the relationship between volume and pressure is not linear in the lungs. And I think to picture that, it's useful to think, well, if you blow off all the air that you have, so you're on empty, and you try to take in half a liter of air, it's really easy because there's nothing in there. But now if you go and you already taken in 3 or 4 liters and you try to add another half liter, well, the effort that it takes to add that half liter at the end of your inhale is very different than it is at the beginning of your inhale. And so by applying,
especially if you don't have the range, if you haven't trained the range of motion.
Yes.
So
yeah, exactly.
The better the range of motion, the easier that's going to be. Yeah, but you're absolutely right.
The body's always going to default to its strengths, right? It's always going to go back to whatever feels most comfortable, most successful in the past. Mm-hmm. And so when you're trying to train something new, it becomes like difficult to maintain that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's important to say that no matter what people want to explore in terms of respiratory training devices, you need to master the technique first, and you need to make sure that your technique stays solid throughout the session with any respiratory device, so that you're not, again, compensating or compromising that work that you're doing. So we have the resistance devices, and we have what do you guys like to call them? Endurance or coordination devices? Luke, how would you describe Breatheway Better?
Breatheway Better, I mean, I like to describe it as an isocapnic device, right? It captures your exhaled gases, and it allows you to rebreathe a large portion of them, so you can keep yourself safe, from breathing too much or too little. I mean, that's one of my proudest things about the device is that it can be used very gently at very low respiratory rates at low volumes, and it works just as well as if you're breathing at 70 breaths per minute at 5 liters per breath. Like it works no matter the range. It's very simple to execute. There's not a lot of learning curve. That's one of the coolest things that we've seen from our preliminary studies, or our in-depth studies actually now, moving forward with people that have not used any sort of respiratory training device in the past, is that they pick it up very quickly. But even more so is athletes that have used different tools in the past, hop on the Breatheway device, and they are just like, it's so simple. Like there's no way to mess it up.
right?
Yeah,
You literally just use it, and that's it. Like it's so simple. And then so the devil becomes in the details with how you can make the most of it, right? Are you going to use it to become faster at breathing, more powerful, right? There's a ton of constriction in just breathing through your bronchial tubes, and if you push enough pressure through there, you're going to get resistance. And so I'd rather a system that was so strong that you're limited by your face hole than needing to constrict it with some other device.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about different interventions on the respiratory training side. So, do you have kind of a basic program that you put your athletes on when they begin using the device before they switch to more specific training, or how do you go straight to what they need relative to the data that you've seen from them? How do you operate?
Yeah, I mean, our methodology has always been privy to doing individual programming, helping athletes with the exact type of training that they need, and so I try to steer people that direction the best I can. As our volume goes up and up and up, we have more of like a beginner program that people kind of put themselves through, starting with a very basic, like technique-based training program, where once they've kind of graduated through that, then we can decide, are we going to spend a little bit more time working on your volume, or a little bit more time working on, excuse me, on your frequency. And so those are sort of the two directions that we tend to guide people in the early days, and then we can get more complicated from there with playing with your ability to deal with CO2 under load, and maybe some altitude training applications and stuff like that.
Okay, I want to go into those more advanced concepts, but maybe to start for me, the starting point, you mentioned before the importance of having spirometry data before you do any kind of dynamic test where you're going to measure ventilation. So if somebody shows, and I like Daniel Crumbach's terminology of capacity and capability, capacity being the spirometry, what you have, capability is how you use it. So if you see someone with let's call it a limitation on the spirometry side, so their FEV1 is low relative to what we should see for their size, how would you just address that? And then we can go into specific interventions for more of the capability side. So what you see when they're actually during the effort.
Oh, I love those athletes that come in that have low FEV1 numbers. That means it's a functional shift, and we're going to see really fun improvements in pretty short order.
Okay.
As the rule, functional takes days, weeks, maybe even hours to teach something functional, whereas structurally that takes a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
And so a functional shift is a fun afternoon for sure. So if somebody comes in with a low FEV1 sort of number from what we would expect to see, then we would actually put them through a little bit more of a volume building session, where you might start out at 20-25 breaths per minute, but trying to mobilize as much as you can. And so again, coming back to technique, we don't want to run before we can crawl. If this athlete's having a hard time crawling, then let's keep the respiratory frequency down to a level that they can control.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we bring that frequency down to 20 breaths per minute, and teach them how to stretch the system as they breathe in and squeeze really, really hard until they are totally empty. And so they start getting more and more comfortable with that total range of motion. As they get more and more comfortable with that, we start seeing that being able to shift up to 25, 30, 35, 40 breaths per minute, onwards and onwards we go. What's cool about that, that FEV1 value is that, we would see improvement in a session or two. In pretty short order, we would see the comfort level of the athlete. It really is just like a teaching of the skill of breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And in pretty short order, we would see a shift in the right direction.
Okay, so you talked about function. Now let's talk structure. So if they have a limitation on their FVC6, so on their total lung capacity, how would you address that?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So FEV6. So we have a good functional FEV1. They're able to sustain that for a long time. And so then we would actually choose an interval that would be challenging for them. We know that this particular athlete, through testing, might be able to hold 35 breaths per minute at 5-liter breaths for 5 minutes. And so we set up intervals like that. All right, we're going to start at that, 4.5 minutes, make sure we get good success rate. We're filling the bag, emptying the bag really well. And then we start drawing that up, slowly pulling that length of time longer and longer. And we watch the numbers, right? Maybe we start seeing a change in the athlete's functional ability, as well as what we want to see, which is the change in their structural tidal volumes. And slowly but surely, they're going to start mobilizing more and more of the bag. That's one of the cool things about the breathe away device is you're not stuck to a given bag size. You can, you can, somebody with a very smaller set of lungs can still use a very large bag and get the most out of it. As they become more fit or more structurally voluminous, they can actually start mobilizing that bag because they're ready for them to use. They're not having to upgrade and change systems when they've aged out or upgraded their system.
How big is the bag on the Breathe Away Better?
It's 5.5 liters.
Okay. Do you have many athletes that can fill it up and empty it completely on every breath?
Yep. Yep, for sure. That's a hard.
Luke works with a couple world-class athletes. The 24-hour mountain bike world champion is one of them, but he also works as one of the top CrossFitters in the world, and a couple of young triathletes. One guy who just won the 24 to 29-year-old age group at St. George.
I'm having him on the podcast tonight. Actually, I'm having Jameson on the podcast tonight.
Oh, fantastic. So one other thing to mention, you were talking about FEV6 and limitations to that. I think it's important to remember that some of those limitations actually can be physical limitations, actually rib mobility and diaphragmatic excursion. The ability to take a full deep breath requires an incredible amount of coordination between multiple joints. And some people have limitations, structural limitations to that can be overcome with manual therapy. And I know that, Sean, I know you've had experience with this, especially with a swimmer who in certain positions actually couldn't contract her diaphragm and allow her ribs to move. She couldn't put her arms over her head and still be able to take a deep breath. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes those structural limitations need to be overcome, not with the device, but again, that learning how to breathe and maybe even having some manual therapy, and whether it's chiropractic care or physiotherapy or massage therapy, to allow those joints, the costovertebral joints, the joints where the ribs attach to the back, to be able to pivot and move appropriately. Does take some time and energy and focus to make sure the ribs are actually moving. So if you see an FEV6 that's diminished from where you expect it to be for their height, it could be a coordination issue of the diaphragm, so not utilizing the diaphragm properly or not able to contract the diaphragm all the way down into the belly, because they've been so used to using intercostal muscles for their breathing. But it also can be a structural limitation to the rib mobility, which needs to be addressed separately through stretching. And there's some great online tools for learning how to stretch those costovertebral joints and get them moving again, using foam rollers and rolled up towels and things like that under different joints to help learn how to breathe deeper before you start using the device. So I think what Luke was referring to is how he uses the device to help maintain those large volumes and train to use those volumes repetitively. But it's also important to recognize that you may need to do some work at rest without the device, just mobilizing joints and moving things.
But yeah, what comes to mind here is the FRA system, or FRC for those who are familiar with Andrew Ospina's work. But it's essentially when we talk about mobility and trying to access it in an active way, when you're doing, for example, pails and rails, you want to first open the space, and then you want to use the space. So it's kind of that same concept of you want to allow the body to move in that new range of motion, and then you want to learn to maintain it over time and be able to use it actively without necessarily the assistance to access it. One way I've been using the Breathe Way Better recently is before I do any kind of sprint intervals on the bike, because we know on the sprint interval that respiration is going to go up, or ventilation is going to go up really, really quickly, and so that can lead to a bit of a sore throat for the following couple days. And so I've been enjoying using the device as part of my warm up. So warm up on the bike, but we know that the respiratory system is kind of the last one to follow when you do any kind of hard effort. So you could technically do a 10-second all-out effort and not necessarily need to breathe a lot, but once you get to 20, 30 seconds and beyond, that becomes a different story. And so sometimes I feel like it's hard to fully warm up the respiratory system on the bike or even on the run without going a little bit too far with your warm up. Yep. So how could someone incorporate that device into a warm up, whether it's for a training session, a hard training session, or maybe even a race?
Can I take that?
Yeah, no, you go. Sure.
So we had some of our best experiences of actually helping athletes warm up for sprint events, and exactly using that idea that knowing how, again, if you go back to the testing, how hard and how fast are they going to have to breathe in the event that they're going to do, whether it's a 1K ski cross-country ski race, or whether it's a 30-second all-out effort or a 1-minute max effort CrossFitter, whatever the exercise is, you can now measure it with VO2 max, so you can see what the end result is going to be. So now warming up the system, and you can super warm it up with a breathe way, is you can actually over breathe what they are going to need to do. So the actual event breathing rate and volume is actually lower than how you've warmed it up. And so you can push the breathing system beyond what they're going to need to do for the event itself. The other benefit of using it like you're using it, Sean, as part of an interval training session is now you're actually getting an extended period of respiratory challenge despite doing very short intervals. So you can do your 10-second, 20-second, 30-second intervals, which are muscularly coordination, very taxing. But like you said, the respiratory system only catches up in the last 10, 15 seconds. And then once the stimulus goes away, your breathing will come back to normal fairly quickly. If you use a breathe way in between those intervals, you can extend that really high intensity breathing for much longer. You'll fatigue faster, so you may not be able to do as many intervals because once you've fried your respiratory system, you'll find the intervals get really, really hard. But the idea and we've used this very successfully with swimmers, is typically they pattern their training sessions as repetitive intervals, whether they're doing 10 100s on 2 minutes. So they swim really fast for a minute, 105, and they take 55 seconds rest, and then they do it again. Instead of taking 55 seconds of full rest, we put them on a breathe way for 50 seconds. And the respiratory training now becomes 10 times 100 on 2 minutes as a 20-minute set. And they've actually done breathing as if they were doing race-paced swimming for 20 full minutes, but they only actually had 10 minutes of hard swimming. So the training stimulus now gets much longer because you've pushed the breathing between the intervals. But just like that, you could do a full warm up as if you've done a really hard swim set just on the respiratory system, and then allow them to start the race fully warmed up, the respiratory system fully warmed up. You have to be a little bit careful that these athletes are well trained with it so that they don't tax themselves in the warm up. And we have seen that with newer athletes who are just playing around with these devices. Initially, they over push themselves, and then they start their sprint and their whatever their interval is, and they're already tired from the breathing training. So this is an advanced technique once you've had control and had some endurance training with it.
I definitely want to talk about that respiratory muscle fatigue in the next few minutes. Luke, could you give an example for one of your trained athletes? So one of the people that have been maybe doing respiratory training for some time, that have great control over their respiratory system. What might a warm up look like with the Breathe Way Better before an intense either session or competition?
Yep. Yeah. So the go-to session for, like, let's say, young World Cup triathlete Brock Hole would be like a 7-minute long warm-up session on the breatheway, where he starts out at 20, 25 breaths per minute and slowly increases over that 7-minute period, to the point where he's breathing at or just above the type of frequencies he would expect to see during his event. And so that might actually be closer to like 45 breaths per minute at the upper end. But the nice thing about doing it on the breatheway is that, like, he's able to access even more volume than he otherwise would, during the actual session itself. And what we've actually found with that is that, well, of course, one, he feels better during the session. But one really fun thing has been he feels more buoyant in the water. Because he's mobilized more volume in his lung capacity, and so with each liter of air he takes in, he becomes more buoyant in the water, and his body position is better because of that. So there's a lot of trickle down effects of just having a well trained and well warmed up system going into any sort of event.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, let's talk about this as maybe a closing and a caution: respiratory muscle fatigue. So you can, just like any muscle, you can fatigue your respiratory muscle, you can fatigue your diaphragm. One thing that I've seen with the athletes that I've used respiratory training with, especially in the first few instances, is really heavy systemic fatigue after even a few minutes of respiratory training. So why does that come about, and why is it important to not overdo that, especially at the start when we're not very well trained?
This was actually the subject of the first published study on respiratory muscles, was done by Fitting, and it was put in the Journal of Respiration, and the title was "Respiratory Muscle Fatigue Limits Physical Exercise Tolerance." And it was a super simple study. All they did was they took 20 good cyclists, they sent them through a time trial, they brought them back a week later, and they put them on a device that was very similar to Breatheway for 5 minutes of all out breathing. They just made them breathe as hard and deep as they could for 5 minutes, and then put them back on the bike and made them do the time trial. And they fell from 10 to 20% slower after 5 minutes of hard breathing. And they just said, I can't pedal anymore. I can't. And the reason is it takes up to 20% of your cardiac output to supply the energy for breathing at high intensities. So 1/5 of your cardiac output is no longer going to your legs to ride or your legs to run. It's going to your breathing system. So tremendous amount of muscle endurance and coordination to coordinate the diaphragm and all the intercostal muscles to breathe deep and fast at high intensity. So it's not hard to imagine that if you take those same muscles and fatigue them, that now you're working with 20% of your active muscles are fatigued. You're not going to be able to move the air as fast and as efficiently, and your body shuts down in preference for being able to breathe for those reasons that we talked about before about CO2 tolerance. So if you're not able to blow off the CO2, your CO2 levels will climb to the point at which your acidity drops below 7.35 and you start feeling very uncomfortable, and your enzymatic system shut down, so you stop being able to produce energy in the same way. So either it becomes a CO2 problem or it becomes a protective mechanism for the body, and this comes down to what Noakes called the metabolic reflex, where the respiratory system becomes the primary life-saving event, and your body recognizes the fact that your respiratory system is failing, so it makes you stop running or makes you stop riding in preference for breathing. And it gives you a choice. You either keep breathing or you keep riding at that intensity, and it'll never choose the riding over the breathing. So there's two mechanisms for why people can't ride at the same intensity. One is a metabolic reflex, and the other one is a CO2 climb. You have to get to the point where they can't blow off the CO2.
Yeah, and if some people doubt the idea of the cost of the respiratory system in high intensity activities, there's a fantastic study by, I think it's Dempsey, who had this assisted breathing machine that essentially unloaded his respiratory system, and the effect on blood flow to the legs was fairly significant. So it just shows
they put them on ventilators. They put them on positive pressure ventilation, which it's fascinating because from an anesthesia point of view, we see that all the time. If you unload people's breathing, their metabolism changes dramatically, and actually the support for their breathing is actually driving the system. And if you take away that drive, it provides energy to a lot of other places. And so we quite often put people on ventilators to save the energy for their other systems that are failing. So we call it life-saving ventilation, and really we're saving the system energy, and that's at the very sick end of people. But you can imagine the same process is in place for the high performance athletes as well. If you can unload the respiratory system by making them more efficient and training those muscles to be better coordinated and move more efficiently, it'll allow more energy to go to their event of moving them forward, whether it's rowing, cycling, swimming, any endurance event.
All right, well, guys, it was fantastic to have you both on. Again, I'm really, really happy we're able to make that happen. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and there's lots of fun stuff to get into. So we will have to schedule another call and do a more in-depth podcast on those topics of respiratory muscle training or respiratory training in general. So for anybody listening or watching right now, leave us a comment below if you have any questions or topics you want us to tackle on the next one. That way we have some direction and we can answer specific questions. But I'll leave you guys a couple minutes to tell us where we can find you guys online. Where can people purchase the Breathe Way Better if they're interested in exploring respiratory training for themselves? I'll let you guys take the floor for the conclusion here.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Sean, for making this happen. Really appreciate it. I mean, it's been a long time coming, and gosh, it's so much fun talking to you guys. And I can listen to Andrew talk all day. I love it. So you can find the Breathe Way device at our website, breathewaybetter.com. Follow us on social media on Instagram, Breathe Way Better. And check us out. Ask us questions. We're super stoked to be involved in the respiratory world, and we have a blog, so leave us comments on there. There's lots of training ideas that we posted there. Our app for the device will be launching in very short order, and so stay tuned for that. And the rest is gravy, as they say.
Yeah, I was gonna say your blog has a lot of resources already, and multiple weeks, if I'm not mistaken, of a template for respiratory training that people can just kind of pick up and go with. Several of them, right. So for anybody who's not sure where to start, you actually can provide that for free on your blog.
Yep. Our mandate is respiratory training for all. And we mean it. We want everybody to be able to access this, not only get the tool, but know how to use it and make the most out of it. And so we're working hard to provide as much of that content as possible, so people are empowered and they have no excuse not to have monstrous respiratory systems. Yeah, everybody should have a monstrous respiratory system. Andrew, Luke, thank you so much to both of you for coming on the podcast. And like I said, I already look forward to the next one.
Absolute pleasure. It's always great to see you, Sean. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Talk to you guys soon.
All right. All the best.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.